Welcome, we are Team Diamonds in the Rough, and today we have a new investment proposal for Lendlease to focus and grow their business through a capital management approach. This capital management approach is centred around an international proposal to penetrate new markets. So we recommend that Lendlease leverage its integrated business model by focusing on the urban regeneration sector and specifically driving growth in Canada, in the state of Ontario, in the short term, and then look at other markets such as China and India in the long term. And of course, this is all subject to Lendlease being able to either accept or to mitigate risks around environmental regulation, the number of fatalities, and credit bubbles. Lendlease is a $1 billion multinational organisation, and it currently operates across 4 different continents, and it has around 12,000 employees globally. It focuses predominantly on the key trends around urban regeneration, ageing population, sustainability, funds growth, infrastructure, and also disruptive technology. We understand that Lendlease's sustainable competitive advantage lies in its integrated business model, which is composed of these 5 factors. So by combining property development, infrastructure development, construction, and then underpinning these and bringing it together with investment management and corporate and treasury functions means that Lendlease can provide the most integrated and best comprehensive solutions to their clients. We also understand that Lendlease's business model is underpinned by 5 core principles, and they are accountability and transparency, bringing a customer focus to everything they do, upholding very high safety standards, embodying sustainability, and also diversity and inclusion. But what's really clear, that front and centre, accountability and transparency, as well as safety, are key core principles for Lendlease operations. So to come up with a new capital management plan, we devised a 5-phased approach, and it was really centred around the Zurich risk room and using all of its functionality to come up with a country that is, and a region in fact, that has the greatest potential for new investment opportunities. So we started with 4 sectors, and we undertook a high-level macroeconomic analysis, and we then, so we explored urban regeneration, retirement living, airports and telecommunications. And we also put the data through risk room just to get a sense check. And eventually what happened was that we discounted airports in fact, because the market size is quite small, there's a few key players, and it has limited opportunities for Lendlease to leverage its integrated business model. We also discounted retirement living as a sector because most of the growth is happening in China due to its high ageing population. However, investing new opportunities does have the potential limit that there's lots of cultural barriers, and also the fact that it has a high risk profile. Similarly, telecommunications was also discounted because most of the booming industries are coming from emerging economies, which also have a high risk profile. So what was left from a very low risk perspective and a market size perspective was urban regeneration. We then took urban regeneration across and shortlisted 20 countries, put them through the Zurich risk room to look more deeply into all the global risks and their impacts. And eventually we then looked at their industry attractiveness in a more comprehensive fashion and ended up with Canada as our potential or region and or state for investment. It's important also to note here that by using Zurich risk room, we were able to represent the core principles that embody Lendlease in terms of customer focus, safety, accountability and transparency, and sustainability by overlaying these these core principles in the Zurich risk room through analysing corporate ethics, voice and accountability, corruption, and good governance. And together, this formed the foundation for what were our non-negotiable risks in Zurich risk room. I will now hand over to Mike, who will talk in more detail around our urban regeneration market entry approach.
Thanks very much, Maggie. I'll start off by giving a quick definition of urban regeneration. It's defined as the renewal and revitalisation of existing urban areas to make better use of underproductive land. Lendlease has strong capabilities in the urban regeneration space. Leveraging its integrated business model is the key to its sustainable competitive advantage, and urban regeneration fits at the core of this process. Lendlease also has strong experience in urban regeneration, currently operating 12 projects worth a combined value of $33 billion. It has an established track record of innovation and sustainable development, with 100% of its projects having achieved or targeting green certification. In our analysis, we identified 4 drivers impacting urban regeneration. The first was the income status of a country, which is defined as a classification of estimated gross national income on a per capita basis. We selected high income countries for our analysis. Second is the population size. We selected countries that have populations of over 10 million. We followed this by urbanisation ratio, which is the percentage of the population living in an urban centre. And finally, the Housing Affordability Index score, which is a ratio of income to dwelling prices. And this is an indicator of affordability. The urban regeneration is a global billion-dollar market in its infancy. To take example, Toronto, its waterfront project is worth $35 billion. Similarly, in New York, the Hudson Yards project is worth $20 billion. And here in Australia, Lendlease operates 3 projects, Barangaroo, Waterfront, and Melbourne Docklands. This has a combined value of $14 billion. So to bring this back to our recommendation, we are suggesting that Lendlease focus its capital management plan on the urban regeneration sector. This is because, firstly, there is an opportunity to leverage its integrated business model. The 4 key drivers associated with urban regeneration demand are present within low-risk developed countries. And finally, there's large global opportunity for these urban regeneration projects. I'll now hand over to Ruben to discuss the Zurich risk room.
Thanks, Michael. So we've now looked at 4 sectors and we've decided that the urban regeneration sector is the most attractive. We've got 4 macroeconomic indicators that Michael has identified that we have determined a short list of countries that we'd like to look at. So the short list of those countries, the top 20, has been put into risk room, and we've looked at 2 key sectors to begin with, the business environment and the socio-political environment, and then we've also done a data overlay to include into risk room the impact of safety in terms of the number of fatalities to determine whether or not the market is a place that we'd like to go into. So what we can immediately see is there's a tight bunching of countries down the bottom left here, and that includes Australia, the US, the UK, Canada, some Scandinavian countries, and we have some outliers out here with Brazil, Mexico, Israel. So to make that diagram a little clearer, we've looked at the top 10. So the top 10, oh sorry, looks like we've skipped a slide here. So the top 10 includes the US, the UK, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and a number of Scandinavian countries, all of which have an attractive risk profile based on the business environment sector, the socio-political sector, and this safety metric that we've put into the system. So how do we decide between those top 10 countries and weed it down into a short list that we can look at? What we thought is we'd look at the non-negotiable core principles of Lendlease. And these include safety, and we've looked at this through the lost time frequency of injury, I believe. And we've looked at injuries and fatalities, and we've also looked at corporate ethics, the dealing with how easy or difficult it is to obtain construction permits within the country, the level of corruption, how good the governance is, the voice and accountability, and the overall scores for those 2 important sectors we spoke about, the business environment and the socio-political environment. And along with that, we've also looked at the Zurich Risk Room ranking. So what we can see immediately, using Australia as the benchmark, and colour coding, green being a lower score, which is good, red being a higher score, which is bad, there is a fair bit of green on the table. Sweden looks good, New Zealand looks good, Norway, Luxembourg. The problem is, all of these markets are just simply too small to sustain an urban regeneration project. So we ended up with a short list of Canada, the United Kingdom and the United States to look at. So, given we've got our shortlist now of Canada, the United Kingdom, the United States, we've considered all of the risks in Risk Room. This is just all the risks in Risk Room overlaid onto a heat map here, and we can see clearly that all 4 countries have an attractive risk profile, meaning they're at the bottom left of this table, this picture here. What we then did is we thought, okay, there's obviously some factors which will impact those countries, which are specific to those countries and are not reflected within the risk room. For the UK, this is Brexit. What we then did is we thought, okay, with Brexit happening, there will be risks that we can identify within the risk room, which we can toggle to then look at the future risk profile of the United Kingdom in the risk room. And the risks that we identified were the business impact of rules on foreign direct investment, the burden of government regulation, brain drain in terms of people's skills and experience being exported overseas, trade tariffs, and trading across borders. The impact is, once these risks were all toggled upwards, that the UK moves from the tight bunching in the bottom left out into the middle here, which means it's a more risky proposition. The next factor that we've identified is the Trump factor, which is a major unknown at this stage, but we wanted to consider it because urban regeneration projects are long, and that would mean that this potentially could impact on the performance within the United States. So the key risks that stood out to us within the Zurich risk room were the business impact of rules on the foreign direct investment, government effectiveness, regulatory quality, expropriation, and the independence of the judicial system. Once these risks were toggled up within risk room, we could see a very big impact where the United States has gone from the bottom left here right into the middle. So obviously we've got a short list of countries. We've got Australia, the United States, the United Kingdom, and Canada. We've considered all the risks within risk room. We've added safety as a data overlay. We now need to decide which of those countries is the most attractive. So what we've used is industry attractiveness is an indicator of profitability. And to determine how profitable those countries are, we have conducted a Porter's 5 forces analysis, and the clear winner for us is Canada. So, considering Canada as a standalone prospect, we thought we would revisit, I guess, the core principles within the risk room, being corporate ethics, corruption, good governance, voice and accountability, and environmental regulation representing sustainability. And what we can see on this diagram here is that Canada actually outperforms Australia and looks fairly attractive on these metrics. We then considered Canada-specific risks. These are any risks that we could identify within the risk room where the risk of operating within Canada was significantly higher than Australia. The risk that stood out for us was business cycle indicator, which is how accurately they predict their future GDP versus what actually happens. The dollar fall, their exposure to a drop in the US dollar, which you'd expect they'd have a very high exposure given that they're neighbouring the US. Falling oil price, which is a major impact because it's a commodities-driven economy. Demographic shift, which is a factor which does impact Canada, but it is also a factor that impacts Canada, the United States, the United Kingdom and Australia with an ageing population. And finally, their exposure to credit bubbles, which is the extent to which asset values could be pumped up with excessive lending. Finally, within Canada specifically, we wanted to consider key market entry risks in the risk room. And for us, we identified via our 5 forces analysis, these were the business impact of rules on foreign direct investment, employing workers, which is obviously critical when you start up in a new country and you have a new project, the quality and quantity of local supply, which Lendlease themselves has identified as critical when they set up in a new country, the burden of government regulation, because after all, Canada will be a new environment to us, and the regulatory quality in terms of is it an environment that we want to work in the first place. So looking at these key risks, we can see that Canada actually performs very close to Australia and has an attractive risk profile. What we then did is, now that we've identified those key risks, we thought it would be valuable to put these key risks into Enablon, which is Lendlease's own risk management tool. So what we've done is all the 15 identified risks have been put onto a heat map. This is their inherent likelihood. which is valuable in itself, but what we'd like to consider first is potential mitigation strategies. Now, we've identified 3 risks that we can mitigate. These are credit bubbles, the number of fatalities, which relates to safety, and environmental regulation. So, in terms of mitigants, for environmental regulation, we identified that Lendlease lives and breathes sustainability, and accordingly 100% of their projects are green certified. That in itself would lend Lendlease to have the skills and expertise to meet the environmental regulations required in Canada. The number of fatalities, once again, this is another core principle of Lendlease. There'd be strong training and a formal induction program for all employees that would be involved in any urban regeneration project, and this would reduce the potential for a fatality on site and any safety issues. Finally, credit bubbles. Through Lendlease's and hopefully our thorough due diligence process, we can identify any areas where there could be an overvaluation of assets being driven by excessive lending and remove those as potential sites. That process in itself would reduce the risk of entering a market which is not attractive. So what does that mean in terms of risk mitigation? What we can see here is all 3 risks have reduced on the heat map. It's a positive effect on Lendlease entering into the Canadian market. So, for market entry strategies, Khadija will help. After you.
Thank you, Ruben. So, after discussing risk mitigation strategies, it's time to consider how we'd enter the Canadian market. We recommend that Lendlease enter the Canadian market via the state of Ontario, and in particular the city of Ottawa. Why have we made that recommendation? First of all, the Canadian government has announced what they call the Build Canada program, which is worth $53 billion. Secondly, the state government of Ontario has initiated what they call the Port Asset Transfer program, and there are 7 ports available for sale in that state. And finally, the same state government has announced what they call the Ottawa Urban Renewal Program, designed to upgrade the city of Ottawa. And there are plenty of legacy sites available in that state. Not to mention, of course, that Ontario as a state is very close to the US states of New York and obviously places like Michigan. At this point, I'm sure you're asking, why have we not considered cities such as Vancouver or Toronto? The primary reason would be inflated asset prices. Secondly, these cities are quite advanced and mature in terms of the urban regeneration space, and there are no legacy assets available for acquisition. Having defined our location, the next step would be to determine how we go about entering the market. We recommend that Lendlease set up an office in the city of Ottawa and pursue what we would like to call public and private partnership projects in conjunction with local partners, so as a joint venture. This would be so that Lendlease acquires the capabilities of doing business in Canada by learning the local way of doing business. Other considerations to take into account when entering Canada. First of all, we need to consider how to access capital, and also if there are any capital control measures in place in that country, particularly when it comes to exit strategies. Secondly, Lendlease should consider leveraging opportunities when they are present in the Canadian market, in terms of the Canadian government is spending a fair amount on public infrastructure projects, and of course it would be sensible to take advantage of that. And finally, it's important to consider regional differences in risk. So different states in Canada have different regulations around foreign investment within their states, and Lendlease should obviously consider those before entering those states. So these are all the short-term approaches on how to enter a market. But as we've mentioned earlier, we've suggested that in the long term, Lendlease consider entering the Chinese and Indian and emerging markets. What this diagram shows is Lendlease's context of doing business in perspective of the global context. Currently, Lend-Lease operates in what it considers low-risk areas, and we are recommending to continue operating in that space for the moment. Unfortunately, the profits and potential for growth in these markets are also limited. What you do notice on this diagram is that there are many markets which are high growth, but also possibly high risk areas. So how would Lend-Lease go about entering those markets? Before we go on to that, we just thought we'd share with you the risk room diagram of these countries, and you can see that India and China compare quite high in terms of risk compared to Australia and Canada and so on. So our recommendation for entering those markets is that Lend-Lease adopt what you would consider entry into medium risk markets as using these places as stepping stones into what you would consider high risk markets. And in the long term, as you can see from this diagram, that's where the global context or market, global markets are shifting. So obviously it would be advisable that Lend-Lease takes advantage of these opportunities.